Hi, I'm Jo Kane, and one-on-one with me today is Neil Deans, the National Resource Manager at Fish and Game. And we're going to be talking about water, and in particular, the recently released national policy statements on freshwater management. Hi, Neil.
Hi, Jo.
Okay, we need to put this in a bit of context. Can you talk us through the process that led up to the release of the policy statements?
Well, it's been quite a long time coming. There's been a lot of discussion.
20 years, I think.
Yes, that's right. Well, even this thing has been in Genesis for probably 5-6 years, and the formal process was started under the previous government. It went through a board of inquiry process with people appointed for their expertise, heard lots of submissions from all over the place, and they reported early in the term of the current government. And at the same time, the government embarked on a new way of looking at trying to manage freshwater, and this was called the Land and Water Forum. And this was getting all the various groups together, the parties that haven't always seen eye to eye, and trying to get them to hammer out some solutions. One of the things that government asked us specifically to do was to look at this national policy statement that had been produced by this board of inquiry, and to say, well, what do we think of it? Could it be brought in? When should it be brought in, and what changes, if any, needed to be made? And so the Land and Water Forum met. We can talk a bit more about that later, maybe. Yes. And one of the outputs was some recommendations on what to do with this national policy statement. And the Land and Water Forum recommended that it should be promoted promptly, and some minor changes. I think there were 4 changes recommended to it. To try and address some specific problems, recognising that it had been most of the way through the process, so it really couldn't be changed significantly. And so that was what was put to government, and government certainly responded quite quickly in producing it, but they made, I think, 23 changes, and some of those are quite substantive.
And those changes obviously have some concerns that Fish and Game decided to commission a report from the Cawthron Institute?
Yes, that's right. Yes, we did. And I guess we had some concerns about it, but we felt it was important for a party with expertise in this area, with expertise in economics and freshwater. And Cawthron Institute has that expertise. They needed to look at it, understand the policy ramifications, both at the national level and also for regional councils, who are the delivery mechanism for water management in New Zealand. So Cawthron have looked at that, and they came out and they highlighted a number of concerns, some of which we already had, but they were able to echo those and perhaps expand on them in some cases.
It seemed that there was a surprise to some of the people about almost a watering down of some key policies that could have made those changes. So can we work through a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. Well, in particular, I guess the Board of Inquiry heard submissions from all the main players, and they deliberated, no doubt at some length, as to what should or shouldn't be in there. They did accept that there needed to be rigorous standards applied, and quickly, because one of the problems in water management has been that when decisions are made about whether consent should be allowed or that kind of thing, what we didn't have often was plans which set how much was available to be used, or how much, what the water quality standard ought to be to protect human health or protect fishable water or whatever. And so what was happening is incremental loss. It's sometimes called death by 1,000 cuts, or salami syndrome. A bit more gets cut off of that which becomes a little bit less. And the result of that, of course, is that many of our rivers have shrunk, and that's been a big problem here in Canterbury, and the water quality has declined. So what we need is to be very clear about what we want to be, what we want the purpose of a river to be. Is it there for fisheries management? Is it there for mahinga kai, for Maori? What is the purpose? What then do we need to protect that? And we've got to stick with that. We can't go beyond it. And what hasn't been happening is that regional plans haven't had that degree of rigour. And it was recognised at the national level, finally, after 20 years. And this thing came in, it was recommended, and I guess the issue was, well, how quickly was that going to be implemented and required to be delivered by regional councils? And that's one of the concerns we have, that there were some very quite exacting requirements in the Board of Inquiry version, and some of those have been watered down, particularly the time frames. I mean, there are some requirements which...
And the time frame now being that you've got to use best practical options, and if you can't do that, then you've got actually 20 years.
Well, that's right. And 20 years is, I mean, the argument used is that, well, some consents have been granted for long periods. Well, that isn't a reason to delay.
Now, you're a consent man, and consents always have conditions on them. The conditions are if you don't adhere to your consent or there's a cumulative effect, they can be re-looked at in a whole of a catchment. I mean, isn't
they can, yes. A regional plan can identify the changes that may be required to consents to bring them all into line. And here in Canterbury, an issue that I had major issue with the council over a long period was that they were issuing consents for the full time that they could be issued for 35 years, and they weren't issued on to a common expiry date within a catchment, so that you couldn't have integrated catchment management, which is a requirement under the legislation. It makes absolute sense. Everyone should be subject to the same rules.
Isn't the disappointing part, and I've certainly picked it up from the Cawthron Institute, saying all it's really doing is sheeting it back home to the regional councils. And if you use the Waikato model, where they did set up some policy framework, and you can tell me what has happened actually in Waikato. It hasn't worked. Yes,
Waikato have tried very hard to improve some pretty poor water quality in that part of the world, and I've worked in the Waikato, so I know it well. And they came up with the idea of having a net improvement in water quality. And regrettably, what they've had is a net decline. And places like Hamilton City, for example, spent $15 million on improving their wastewater treatment. And the amount of reduction in nutrient from that has been exceeded by the increase in nutrient from intensification of land use in the Waikato catchment.
And the government has also clawed quite a bit of money into the Waikato catchment to help them clean up their rivers, and into Rotorua as well.
Yes, they have. Very large sums of taxpayers' funds have gone into fixing up mistakes that have been made. And to be quite frank, New Zealand can't afford to spend that sort of money all over the country. We've got to do better than that. And of course, users of water are making use of a publicly managed resource. If they are using it and it is being degraded by their use, why should we be having to pay twice, both for the degradation and then for the fix-up? Really, this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and I think industry, for example, is realising it. The responsibility falls on them primarily. But the regional councils, through these sorts of provisions at a national level, are now getting a very clear steer. The question is, how far off before we get this to happen? The Board of Inquiry had extremely rigorous timeframes, and they were going to slot things straight into regional plans which had immediate effect. Now we've got things which may happen by 2014, but many of them won't need to happen for another 20 years.
OK, we'll come back right after the break to pursue that issue. Welcome back, where we're talking water with Neil Deans from Fish and Game. The Minister Smith said Fish and Game's comments were disappointing and a return to the combative approach, and you're out of step with the rest of the community. Dirty, daring rhetoric was mentioned, and yet in the Cawthron Institute report, I don't see anything about dirty daring. I see about intensive development. How concerned are you that you've been almost put into the camp as a radical group?
Yeah, it is very concerning, because Fish and Game have been, over quite a long period, heavily engaged in collaborative processes. And indeed, the collaborative process was the one that recommended, through the Land and Water Forum, that the National Policy Statement, with a couple of minor adjustments, be proceeded with as was. Why then do we have 23 changes, some of which are much more substantial than was recommended? And I'm afraid the Minister's statement on that, he's hiding behind legal advice that he won't give us. So I'm afraid I don't accept that for a moment. We're definitely a party to collaborative processes. We haven't used the DD word for some time. Other people do. It's taken on a life of its own. I mean, we want to get past that. We've got to work with the dairy industry as well. Yes, we have some issues, and but the dairy industry, to their credit, are recognising that they need to engage with the environmental sector as well.
Just this week, there was the inference that there was interference by Dairying New Zealand in the Huranui Waiau. There seems to be, from the forums that we use to derive these policies, do you think there's some interference that has...
Well, there was in this case, and I know the details of that, and yes, there was some concern that Dairying New Zealand had attempted to address issues after the matter had been, that particular matter had been resolved. At least to their credit, both Dairy New Zealand and Commissioner David Cagle accepted that actually they'd had bad process, and both parties said, look, sorry, we did the wrong thing. And it has been, I think, addressed, and I guess I'm quite pleased that we've been able to resolve that, accept the apology, and I would hope move on. Because the fundamental point here, and this is where I fundamentally disagree with Minister Dr Smith, that we have been involved in collaborative processes. That means that all parties have to take responsibility. We're not isolating ourselves here. It's the Minister, actually, who's taken exception to what the recommendations of the Land and Water Forum was, not the other way around.
Yes,
and so I'm not impressed with that kind of view. And I think it's important to also recognise that the Cawthron Institute doesn't have anything, any particular vested interest in this. They've simply evaluated the proposed new policy statement for its merits, and they found it somewhat wanting.
One of the things that it comes out with, saying that regional councils can, and rivers and lakes can be further degraded as long as regional councils have plans to improve others. So it seems that there's this offset now within this policy statement. Who's going to decide?
Well, that's
the sacrificial rivers or lakes.
That's exactly the concern. Are you going to volunteer your lake to be the sludge channel? And I use that term because that was what the legislation used to say. You could have some sludge channels. Now, that's perhaps a bit extreme, but the reality is that what that's saying is that you would accept, or someone will accept, their river being degraded so that someone else's can be improved. I don't think that's what New Zealanders want. I think we do want fishable, swimmable waters everywhere, and we want to make sure that our land uses, that our industrial discharges, that our urban uses actually deliver that.
Is Fish and Game worried that DOC, the Department of Conservation, is seen to be pulling back from some of the processes that, or the submissions they should be in, and leaving you actually out there on your own?
Yes, we are. Very worried. I've had personal experience of that further north in Marlborough, where DOC decided to pull out. And that's also happened in Southland with the Ariti Water Conservation Order. It happened in Otago with the Nevis Water Conservation Order. We're very concerned. We seem to be having to do DOC's work for it. And I guess the arguments they're using are not satisfying me, and I've been involved in this game, and I've worked for DOC quite a long time ago now, so I know the pressures they're under, but I don't accept that they can walk away from this because it's their responsibility. And I guess the question has to be asked, if DOC isn't there, who is going to be advocating for conservation of natural resources? It's not actually Fish and Game's job.
No, no. So if we put it into a Canterbury context, and Canterbury has had the double whammy, you know, it's had September and it's had February, and the community at large is very distracted. And there seems to be a dearth of what was normally called the environmentalists sitting out on the left to fight these fights. Are you worried that the community seems to have been lost in the battle to protect and enhance our rivers? Well,
I guess we would like to think that the community is there, but it has to be there represented by somebody. And I think groups like Forest and Bird, for example, have stepped up to some extent to do that. Members of the community, there are a lot of passionate people, and one of the good things is the Environment Canterbury is getting zone committees up and running, people out there in the community representing a wide range of interests getting involved in these things. But they're very demanding of people's time, and be they from industry or anywhere else, and it's quite difficult to do all this stuff.
So in Canterbury, they're following on and starting to implement the ethos of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, and quite quickly have set up all these committees. Do you think they? So let's just work through. You think they're working quite well?
Well, it's probably early days yet. I know that the first one probably off the block is the Huranui one, and my understanding is they've come up with some quite strong recommendations to both enable development but also protect the environment. And I guess that's the challenge for Canterbury. Canterbury has tremendous opportunities in the water space, but we also have tremendous high values. I mean, salmon fisheries, braided river birds, internationally important. Very important areas for
Are we doing well in those issues, in the fishery and in the braided birds? Are we getting better? We understand it as
well. I don't know that we're necessarily doing better. In some particular cases, we are with the money that's gone in the Mackenzie country to Project River Recovery, for example. That's done some quite good stuff with black stilts and other things. But in many of particularly our smaller rivers, they've been going back, and quite seriously, over quite a long period. So those are not getting better. And some of rivers, for example, like the Selwyn is the celebrated case, where it used to have a major trout run in it, and that's dwindled down to almost nothing now. But the river itself has dwindled down to almost nothing. I can recall speaking to my great uncle, because my family comes from Canterbury, about fishing in small streams, which are now completely bereft of fish and indeed don't even flow for 2 or 3 months of the year now. I mean, that's quite common throughout Canterbury, and a lot of that's happened in the last 20 years. So there's a lot of catch-up that we have to do to fix this. And if we want Canterbury, if we want New Zealand to be the clean green thing we keep trying to say that it is, we've got to do a lot better than we have been.
Yes. We'll come back right after the break. Welcome back. We were talking about water. Fish and Game has applied for more water conservation orders to protect rivers than any other organisation, and yet there is a worry in Canterbury that the 4 that we have are under threat.
Yes, and rightly so, because yes, we've applied for probably 7/8 of the water conservation orders around the country, and we're very proud of the fact that we've been the party that caused these things, the national parks of rivers sometimes called. And that has recognised salmon fisheries, wildlife, iwi values and so on. In Canterbury, of course, water conservation orders have been watered down. They no longer have the special status that they have elsewhere in the country. And of course, we're expecting that there will be proposed changes to the Rakaia, and there are already changes being negotiated for Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Waihora, we hope that that will improve the situation because it will broaden the base of the values recognised. In the case of the Rakaia, though, the proposal is to allow more water for either hydro and or irrigation. And that, of course, is a concern because the way that conservation orders are at the moment, if you can prove that something is nationally outstanding, then unless industry is even more important, and that's never happened, then you have to protect that. Now, what's happened now is that you don't have to protect it. It's just something to be considered alongside everything else. And you can't have protection on that basis. Something's either nationally outstanding, is worthy of protection, or it can be diluted down, as I was referring to before. And we've seen so many other rivers and water bodies in New Zealand that have been diminished, usually by that death of 1,000 cuts. Mm.
I want to ask you about a community. If we took Christchurch itself, who wake up every day and turn on a tap or water their garden in response to what I saw in the Huranui plan, which was that some of the community didn't like that people that lived outside of the community having a say on how they were going to manage their rivers. Do we run the risk in Canterbury of leaving out a big part of the community and the history about our rivers and lakes?
Well, it depends what you mean by community. I mean, in Canterbury, Christchurch is part of the community, is it not? Yeah. And I think what these things need to do is to recognise that people who live in an area obviously have an interest in that area, but so do people who may recreate in that area. For example, in the Huranui, kayakers who go there come from all over New Zealand to kayak in that area. Does that mean those people should have no say in that? Yes, their interest is different, but it doesn't mean it's not real. And one of the issues is, well, how much relevance do you have? I guess in the end, we're managing this public resource for the public. And why should some interests have interests greater than others? And that applies to anybody. So it's a question. One of the great things about water is you could manage it for multiple purposes, but you do have to protect the outstanding. And that's what water conservation orders are supposed to do. And we've got 4 of them in Canterbury because we have had outstanding resources here in Canterbury.
So going back to the tools that we have that Environment Canterbury is using at the moment, which is that, and it took a while to get the water strategy together, we all have to put our hope that that approach that they're using is going to deliver some real results. But does this policy framework stack up in light of where those groups may take what is going to happen on when we put the economics against the ecological and we put the social against the cultural?
Well, the challenge for the Canterbury community generally will be to say to what extent are we going to allow socio-economic factors to limit the water resources that already exist. In other words, the braided river birds or the recreational uses. And to my mind, we haven't got a sustainable management of those things if they are allowed to be degraded. Now, it's actually possible to have your cake and eat it. And one of the things that the Land and Water Forum agreed was that water storage options are going to be the way forward so that we can have more development, but that we're not going to degrade the key resources. And that's going to be the key thing that we do, is to make sure that that's done in a way that works. The biggest challenge here in Canterbury will be enabling the intensification of land use without further degrading water quality. And that's the biggest challenge in front of Canterbury now.
And so if that's the challenge, what are the critical elements that the leaders, and which is, in this case, it's Environment Canterbury and the small communities that are in those precincts, what are the critical elements that need to be considered?
Well, the main one from the water point of view is how much, or how little water do you need, and how much nutrient and other things do you need to put onto the land in order to have a certain amount of stocking rate, or what's the best use you can put the land to? Is it going to be dairying? Is it something else? Is there some horticulture that we should be operating with here? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. It's not my area of expertise. But if we're going to be using water in that way, what we can't do, because we have to pick up the cost, and this is what's happened in the Rotorua Lakes, we, the taxpayer, have picked up the cost, $80 million in that case, over $100 million in Taupo's case, for the mess that's been made in those cases. We don't want to have to do that. New Zealand can't afford that, and that's not sustainable.
Do you think that Canterbury could possibly be on the front foot in that it is quite a long way forward in the management that it wants to do, but that we could end up actually being the leaders? We
could do. Yes, Canterbury certainly could do that. There's a lot at stake here in Canterbury, and I guess that's been... I mean, the Canterbury Water Management Strategy now is trying to get people together, it's trying to get parties together to say, look, how can we shape the future so that it both protects what's there and enables further development? And that's a very difficult challenge. It's possible, but it has to be done with a great deal of care, and it won't be done by a sort of cheapest is best mentality. And that's what is scary about some proposals, that they're just looking at the simple economics. If it means that you have to spend a bit more to put a dam and a storage dam off a main river, for example, so that it's not ruining habitat or recreation, then so much the better. We have got a good example in the form of the Opuha scheme in South Canterbury. We need to see more like that.
I guess the question that comes about is what are your key concerns? You know, we talked about right at the beginning of the interview. What have you highlighted that Canterbury could do better?
Well, I guess Canterbury's now embarked on these collaborative processes all over the place, and it's becoming quite difficult actually to manage. And
resource hungry.
Very, very resource hungry, and it's very demanding of time of the commissioners and the various parties to this. But you know, we have to do it. We have to do it as well as we can, and we have to seriously face up to some of these challenges about, well, it may be that we can't develop as much as we would like, or that we can't develop in a particular way. We have to do it some other way. We have to accept, in the end, there are environmental constraints that you can't go beyond. The alternative is you finish up in those polluted parts of the world, and we don't want to be like that. New Zealand cannot claim to be clean and green on one hand, and on the other, be degrading the environment. And certainly I don't agree with the government's line that New Zealand has really high water quality. It does up there in Department of Conservation Estate in the backcountry. It doesn't in the lowland country. And in a very short space of time, water quality and quantity is severely degraded in New Zealand, and we've got to do better than that.
Thank you very much for coming in today, Neil. And this is the second in a series of 6 about water. Thank you for tuning in to One on One.